Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways you can support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate, or become a member where you get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme in return. Today, I am delighted to welcome John Greenacre and Mike Peters. John is a former Army Air Corps officer and Gazelle pilot with over 23 years of experience. He participated in operations in the Gulf and Balkans and served in Germany and Kenya. He holds a PhD from the University of Leeds and is currently a lecturer at the University of Suffolk. Mike is former Army Air Corps soldier and officer with 34 years of service in both air crew and ground crew roles. Mike deployed on operations in Northern Ireland, Cyprus, Iraq and Afghanistan, and he is now a full-time historian and battlefield guide. Today they will introduce their new authorised history of the Army Air Corps operations. There will be time for questions at the end of the talk for both our online and in-person audiences. For our online audience, please post the Q&A questions in the Q&A chat bar. These will be put to the speaker at the end. Moving on to technical points, should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us. Also, we find that refreshing your browser solves most issues. With all that said, I'll now pass over to Mike and John. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Mike, so I'm the lesser educated person of the duo. However, I did fly in the Lynx outside, and he's a Gazelle pilot, so obviously I have the edge. So we're going to talk to you today about Ops Normal and the origins of the title of the book. For a start, Operations Normal is a radio call which most aircrew would give to say that everything's okay, we're flying from A to B, and periodically you give your call sign and say Ops Normal. But we changed that in the context of when we were coming up with the idea of the book as what to say, and really we were trying to emphasise the fact that the Army Air Corps in its existence from September 1957 till the present day has been constantly in operations. It's one of the smallest parts of the modern British Army, and every single operation, rather like the Postal and Courier and the Catering Corps, however far more aggressive, is the Army Air Corps have been there all the time. So if ever you see Army Air Corps soldiers on parade, you always see they have nearly all of the medal ribbons because helicopters are a prerequisite of modern warfare. And we both worked together for a number of years and then came together. We were sharing an office together in Attack Helicopter Force at Wattisham in Suffolk. And we've both written our own books about World War II history. And we often mused about why there wasn't a decent history, operational history of the Army Air Corps. And there are certainly other books, which are, the thrust and the spread of them wasn't exactly what we thought it should be. So when the Corps, Regimental Headquarters, got together and said, we gathered a cabal of potential authors into a room and said, Regimental Council, we need to have our history written. We sort of did our audition and secured the gig, which took a while because of COVID and various other factors, but we're there. Volume 1 is here in concrete, almost, and Volume 2 will be out early next year. Volume 1 takes you from 1956, which you're about to talk about, through to the beginning of the Cold War, and we've done that between us. So it's a labour of love, and hopefully it's supported by the Army Air Corps itself, and the Regimental Secretary, Bernie Fowler, is here today to see exactly what we are talking about and to check that we have actually done what we said we'd do. So we're going to do that. So I'm going to talk to you first of all about before the formation of the Army Air Corps, and that's really the legacy of the glider pilot regiment, the Royal Artillery AOP squadrons at the end of the Second World War, how that sort of drifted along because the Army still needed some utilities, still needed some reconnaissance aircraft. And the RAF, there's lots of talk about how the RAF didn't want an Army Air Corps. It's actually, as we dug into it, it's not quite true. They're quite happy because if you think back to the Cold War into the late 40s, early 50s, the Air Force was fixated on jets, rocket aircraft, unmanned aircraft, that kind of thing. They weren't too bothered about helicopters or specifically about light reconnaissance aircraft. And John's going to talk a little bit about how the Army muscled into that space and developed its ideas from the legacy ideas it had before. But it really starts, as all things seem to with the modern Army Air Corps, what was called RAF Andover, or Middle Wallop, as some of you will know it today. And the Joint Experimental Helicopter Unit, which is a tri-service organisation, which was formed to say, these helicopter things, do they actually work? Can we make them work? How good are they? And as the name suggests, it was joint. Army, Navy and Air Force air crew and RAF ground crew primarily, working out of Andover to experiment with the use of helicopters and which helicopters would be the right ones to use. That's all accelerated with the Suez Crisis in 1956, which we're going to talk about. And that sees Army aircraft. All right, let's click it. There we go. Yeah, manual, yeah. It's always good to have a gazelle pilot in the left-hand seat. So it sees Operation Musketeer, which is the first ever heliborne assault in history. And that's done by British aircrew from aircraft carriers. And one of the funny things about the book, when we set the parameters, we said, well, we'll start off with 1956 and Operation Musketeer, and you will see British Army pilots flying helicopters off HMS Ocean into Libya and into Egypt in 1956. And we'll finish at 2017 with Operation Ellamy, when we'll see British Army helicopters flying off another HMS Ocean into Libya in 2017, so we'll go full circle. And that's one of the things we found as we've gone through this. We both, as you've heard between us, have got nearly 60 years of experience in serving in the Army Air Corps and thought we knew it well, thought we knew it inside out. And you find these centric cycles keep repeating themselves, and these new ideas, which aren't new, which are triggered by technology. And this is Captain Shepherd, who's flying a Sycamore helicopter. And if ever you've seen a Sycamore, if ever a helicopter was never meant to fly or be used for troop, there was the Sycamore. And you can see one of these aircraft from Suez in the Army Flying Museum at Middle Wallop. It's just, everything's wrong about it, but they use it along with the Whirlwind. And we see these guys going, the title of the unit changed from experimental helicopter unit to helicopter unit, and being tasked to mount this heliborne assault onto Suez. There are a few problems.
Nope.
One that always comes up is having been very good at combined operations during World War II, and that finishes in 1945, as you all know, we just abandon all those things that we learned, all those lessons identified, lessons learned, or, yeah, we don't need those anymore, and we get to the same old problem. We come back to doing this again in 56, and there aren't enough airborne aircraft to drop paratroops, there aren't enough helicopters, there aren't enough ships to carry the troops that we need to do that, even though British defence doctrine is going along those ways. And we're still thinking about whether we should have an Army Air Corps or not. And the problem we have is when we put these helicopters on these helicopter carriers and send them out to sea, is they use different fuel to the Navy. And the naval ships haven't got the fuel storage tanks to carry that fuel. So we take the Bowsers with us. And anyone who's been around the Army Air Corps knows it's all about the Bowsers. You know, and here we are on our first ever operation before the Corps even formed, and it's like, where will we put the Bowsers? And then they put them on the deck of the carriers, and the Royal Navy aren't very happy about this. It doesn't fit with their plan, their loading schemes, etc. So, well, if they catch fire, they're going over the side. So it's right, okay. So we're going into a combat operation with our fuel Bowsers strapped to the carrier or on the helicopter decks. And we're going to have to think about that the whole time because it's different fuel and how do we resupply that. And that never changes. It's always the same. So when later on we'll see Apache coming in, which isn't meant to go on aircraft carriers, and we'll say, yeah, we'll do that. Anyway, let's stick with Suez. And so we have to find ground crew, which are mainly Royal Air Force at this stage in JHU. We have to find the pilots from all three services. And as you can see, there's no E. The E is taken out of it. And they're going to basically fly in 4 or 5 Commando Royal Marines and a heliborne assault into Suez. And there are no maps, which is ironic when you think who built the Suez Canal and who was around in Egypt in 1944, 45, etc. They struggle to get the right maps. And one of the guys you're going to hear about is Lieutenant Colonel Francis Graham Bell, when we talk about Aden. He's a line pilot flying one of these Sycamores at the time. He says, I remember my mum sent me a postcard from Port Said some years ago, and she said she mentioned going past the entrance to the canal and seeing Lessup statue. She said, we'll head for the entrance to the canal, we'll find the landing zone. So they go from a reference in his head saying, follow me, from a postcard from years before, no actual map. And they're going under fire, all these things that you associate with Vietnam are already happening in 56 at Suez. It is a success. I'll say success, they get away with it. And they prove the concept that the helicopter can do things that fixed-wing aircraft can't do. And if you haven't got enough paratroops, you can do this. And it very early on establishes the utility of helicopters for casualty evacuation and for resupply. So Suez is a great success and sets us up for what's going to come next. We have you can see a Sycamore here with some Royal Marines squeezed in, and I mean squeezed in, 3 or 4 to an aircraft. If you ever Google a Sycamore after this, you'll see the tail rotor hangs down really low. The blades are odd. It's just not right. But they make it work. They make it happen. And they carry out a successful heliborne assault. And as I said earlier, we are the first people to do that in 1956, in November 56. So it's a huge success. So we come out of Suez with a firm tick, VG, Army helicopters is a go. We need to do it. And the RAF are quite happy to say, yes, we think Army helicopters are needed. But now he's got to persuade the Army that it needs less tanks and some more helicopters, as ever was it so, and how they're going to spend that money, and who's going to fly these aircraft, who's going to support them on the ground. Will it be the RAF? Will it be the Army? And we'll find that those existing units that are still ticking along around the globe in the outposts of the receding empire have got to be moulded into a new organisation. And how will that happen? And they're going to do that not quite under fire, but whilst on operations. So the Army Air Corps is actually born on operations. So that's the scene setter. That's JHU coming back from Suez, and now it's the ball's in the court for what do we do about our future Army Air Corps.
Yeah, so as Mike has said, when the Army Air Corps is formed on the 1st of September 1957, so it partly comes out of the Sandys report of 1956, the Defence White Paper, partly out of the experience of what happens at Suez. And the RAF are quite happy about this initially because it means they can divest a whole load of stuff that they don't really want anymore. And they are the light liaison and reconnaissance units that they've got spread over the world. So they hand these over to the Army Air Corps and say, right, they're yours now, thank you very much. And that's why, as Mike says, on the day that the Air Corps is formed on the 1st of September, it's on operations immediately. And it's on operations in 3 different places in the world, all very different. So it's taking part in the Cyprus emergency from day one. It's taking part in countering Operation Harvest, the IRA's border campaign in Northern Ireland in 1957. And it's also thrust straight into the Malayan emergency as well. So the unit that's handed over from the RAF to the Army Air Corps on day one is 656 Squadron, which was one of the original Aero P squadrons with the RAF from 1942. It's been reformed in 1948 in Malaya, specifically for the emergency, and then the Army Air Corps takes it on and renames it 656 Light Aircraft Squadron. And 656 Squadron is one of those squadrons that has its own history. It's got its own published book by Guy Warner. So it's spread right across the Malay Peninsula, as you can see there, the different flights. So each of those flights is about 35 men, about 6 pilots, and about 12 technicians. I'll talk about the technicians in a moment, because there has to be a change in where those technicians are coming from. And those aircraft, by the time, on the 1st of September 1957, the emergency is on the wind down by then. So pretty much all of the insurgency that's still happening is happening up in the Cameron Highlands, which is challenging country, jungle covered, up to 7,000 feet. That's where the Army Air Corps' first aircraft are operating. They're conducting, although some of the flights are called liaison and some are called recce, there's a blurred line really, they're all doing the same thing pretty much. But they are doing reconnaissance for the troops on the ground. They're taking aerial photographs for the troops on the ground. They're dropping supplies. They're illuminating at night from the aircraft. They're dropping battle simulators into the jungle to try and flush the insurgents out. They're doing pretty much everything except Kazivac. And the reason they're not evacuating casualties is because at this stage, the only aircraft that the Army Air Corps has is the Auster. So by 1957, pretty much the whole of what's now the Army Air Corps has moved over onto the Auster Mark 9 from the old Aero P6. And the Auster Mark 9 is ideally suited to operations in Malaya. It's got a wider wing area than the old Aero P6, a more powerful engine, which means in a 6-mile-an-hour headwind, it can take off in 50 feet. That's all it requires to take off and to land as well. It's also got big balloon tyres, disc brakes, which makes it better for landing on the sort of ground it has to land on there. These are the same aircraft that are handed over from the RAF, but what's not handed over is the technicians to work on them, because the RAF says, thank you very much, we'll take our technicians away. The Army, you're going to have to provide your own technicians now. So suddenly the REMI has to suddenly create aircraft technicians, something that it's never had before. It has one advantage at the time, in that this is during national service. So as a national service intake comes in, the REMI can have a look and say, right, any of you guys worked with aircraft before, and there are guys who've been apprentices with de Havilland and Rolls-Royce, and so they cherry-pick those, take them away for a bit of training on the Auster, and they're the guys who become the first aircraft technicians working there. But it's pretty challenging, even though the Malayan emergency is on the wind down, and part of the early birth of the Army Air Corps is typified by jungle operations. But in Malaya, it's on the wind down, but it's still dangerous, very dangerous, and as we'll see in a moment, and any CASEVAC still relies on the Royal Air Force, because the Auster can't land in a small clearing to take a casualty out. Only a helicopter can do that. So, for example, this is Captain John Tadman, who's from the Lincolnshire Regiment, but flying with 656 Squadron. He crashed up near Crow in Perak on the 13th of March 1962. He was caught in a downdraft, hit a clump of bamboo, crashed, aircraft burst into flames. He had to crawl out of the burning aircraft. So he'd managed to call a mayday. So later that day, he was located by an RAF Vickers Valletta, a fixed wing, who pinpointed where he was. The next day, a helicopter came to see if it could extract him, found that there was no clearing anywhere near where he'd crashed, and he managed to signal to the helicopter that he was immobile because he had a dislocated hip and severe burns as well. So 2 days later, an 8-man SAS team, including a doctor, had to be parachuted into the jungle, hack their way to John Tadman and find him, sort his leg out, camp overnight. The next day, stretchers and chainsaws were parachuted to them, and they then carried him 1,500 yards, nearly a mile, through the jungle till they could find a suitable place, and then spent 2 days building a 25-foot square HLS in the jungle, and eventually an RAF, I think what it was now, that came in to get him. An RAF Dragonfly came in to get him on the 20th of March, a week after he'd crashed. So he had a week in the jungle with a dislocated hip before he could be evacuated out. And it's this stage that the Army really, and you see it not just in Malaya but in Cyprus as well, begins to think, we're losing ground here. The RAF has taken on the helicopter with great zeal, and we're left with all the Austers. And if we don't do something with helicopters as well, we're going to get left behind. We're going to become irrelevant before we've even really started. So Malaya continues. The emergency comes to an end in 1962, but the Air Corps remains in Malaysia until 1974, when it eventually withdraws from Singapore. But during that period, it doesn't have to move very far over to Borneo for the next operation, for the Borneo confrontation. So in fact, aircraft from 656 had been sent to Borneo earlier, right from 1957, to take part in anti-piracy operations. And then in 1962, they're sent to deal with the Brunei revolt. 14 flight is sent over. And from there, the confrontation with Indonesia develops when the two northern territories, Sarawak and Sabah, are going to become part of the Malaysian Federation, and Indonesia doesn't want that to happen. So much of what, and this is a pattern that we both talk about and we talk about in the book, everything that's been learnt in Malaya just gets picked up and transferred to Borneo. And the aircraft in Borneo are doing pretty much the same thing. And the balance of effort slowly changes from Malaysia across to Borneo. And some of the aircraft, the Beaver, which I think Mike will talk a bit more about in a moment, the Beavers actually self-deploy from Malaysia to Borneo, about 1,500 miles across the South China Sea to get from one to the other. And there's a 1,250-mile border there to patrol. Again, recce, aerial photography, and everything else that they were doing in Malaya, pretty much, initially just with the Auster again. While we've been writing the book, we've come across some pretty remarkable individual stories that we've managed to recover from the archives. And possibly my favourite relates to this accident. This Auster was...
Not just about accidents.
No, it's not just about accidents, but this one is pretty remarkable, as you'll hear in a moment. This Auster was being flown by Sergeant David Thackeray on the 18th of December 1963, and he had a passenger on board, Wing Commander Melville Ross, who was a padre, one of the most senior padres in the RAF. And Thackeray was flying his Auster into small airstrips along the border to deliver mail, and so that the padre could meet the troops back in and away again. They were engaged by .5 machine gun fire from the Indonesian border, and the aircraft was hit. The wing commander was hit in the chest, and Thackeray was hit twice in the left arm by half-inch bullets. He realised that he couldn't get back to Kuching, where their base was, or to one of the other airstrips, because the padre would probably be dead before they got there, and he was bleeding profusely and thought he'd probably black out before he got there. So he made the decision to try and land the Auster on a helicopter landing site nearby in the jungle, so a 25-foot square cleared piece of ground in the jungle. So he approached it. It was manned by the Marines at the time, who couldn't work out why an Auster was about to try and land there. And he worked out that he could probably come in and glide and turn the engine off at the last minute and just dump it onto the ground. So he lined the aircraft up once to try once, and it wasn't quite right. So he went round to do it again. As he went round to do it again, his left arm snapped as he was trying to turn the aircraft, and he lost control of the aircraft. Had to recover control with the right hand, and he then had a problem because he's only got one hand, and he couldn't fly the aircraft and turn all the switches off and everything else that he needed to do to make a safe landing. So he took a couple of attempts again to fly in, and then worked out that at the last minute, if he put the flight control stick between his legs, he could flick some of the switches off. He was still doing 50 knots, so he thought as he came in, if he tried to put it in more or less vertically and drop it on its tail into the cleared gap, which is what he's done there, which is why it's in that odd position. The Marines came out. The padre was already dead. He didn't die in the crash. He died from his chest wounds before he got there. And Thackeray was taken out and recovered fully from his wounds. He was recommended for a Distinguished Flying Medal, but for whatever reason was downgraded, and he was just mentioned in dispatches. But it's a remarkable story of tenacity and flying skill, and this comes out all the way through the book.
I think one thing we haven't touched on yet is that that's a sergeant pilot, and post-war, the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force have gone back to commissioned pilots. The Army never did. So the whole reason that the Army wanted to hold on to its own Army Air Corps was to have this integral support, this close support of having soldiers in the cockpit who understand the problems on the ground and fly correspondingly, but also to use NCO aircrew. And every now and again, the Army Air Corps has dabbled with the idea of not having NCO aircrew and then realised that the error of its ways and gone back to how growing a mix of commissioned and NCO aircrew. And the same can be said later of it developing its own ground crew.
Yeah, and that takes us on nicely to here, because at this point in the Air Corps' history, really nobody in the Air Corps has joined the Army Air Corps. They've all come from somewhere else. All of the pilots and officers are all transferring in, and the ground crew. There was no direct recruitment of Army Air Corps ground crew until 1973. So up until that point, all the ground crew had to be transferred from somewhere else. So here in Borneo on patrol, you've got Air Trooper Thompson, who is wearing an Army Air Corps badge, but you've also got Gunner Wilson there with an Army Air Corps beret, but still with his gunner's cap badge. And this is a period where the ground crew, really seemed to enjoy, the ones that we've spoken to, what was going on. They were very independent. They had a lot of flexibility. They were taken out to small jungle sites and left there for weeks at a time to operate on their own, refueling, along with a couple of REME personnel to maintain the aircraft. They were given a lot of trust, and we'll see how that changes a bit later on. But the fact that there were no direct recruited Army Air Corps personnel at this time makes the Army Air Corps quite fragile, and its position quite fragile as well. And what makes it even more fragile is in the early 1960s and 1962, because the helicopter is now starting to prove itself, the Army decides, well, why doesn't every regiment have its own helicopters? Yeah? Like it has its own, I don't know, transport and Land Rovers and trucks. Why doesn't it have its own helicopters as well? So there's an experiment.
It's not that barking at the time. If you look at the technology of the time of the Sioux helicopter, it's not as barking as it sounds, but actually it is barking.
It turns out to be barking. So the unit light aircraft concept is trialled with the 1st Queen's Dragoon Guards in 1962. It's found to be a success, and so it's rolled out across the Army. So almost immediately, not every, but a whole raft of infantry battalions, Royal Armoured Corps regiments, gunner regiments, even Royal Army Service Corps regiments are given their own aircraft. And this, again, really puts the Army Air Corps, which is less than 10 years old at the time, in a very difficult position, because if everybody can run their own helicopters, what's the point of having an Army Air Corps? And even titles change. People no longer talk about the Army Air Corps, they talk about Army Aviation much more widely. And the Army Air Corps almost doesn't quite disappear, but it begins to lose its direction and its reason for being there for some time. Even the journal changes its name from the Army Air Corps Journal to the Journal of Army Aviation, so it can include everybody.
And it is interesting, we both talked about it quite a lot, is where you see someone like the Queen's Dragoon Guards who take it very seriously and use their air troop for proper air reconnaissance and integrate it with their armoured car squadron, etc., and work together to develop, hone their skills as reconnaissance platforms. Other units use it to fly the CO around as a CO staff car and for fates and things like that, displays. It's very different.
Yeah. And I'll talk a bit more about it later. This is a Scots Guards. So the Bell Sioux that then becomes the Westland Sioux is selected as the unit light aircraft. The Royal Army Service Corps units that have aircraft have the Beaver, but all the infantry and armoured corps and gunner regiments end up with the Sioux. Which is good because the Sioux can do very limited CASEVAC. It's a very light aircraft. It does observation, but not a lot else. The real change comes when the Scout comes into service. So developed as the P531, it comes into service. I have to remind myself of the date. 1963 is when it's first delivered, and it's immediately on operations in Borneo and elsewhere. But it has real problems when it first arrives. So it's delivered late for a start, no surprise there probably, largely due to industrial action. But it has several major problems. So it's powered by a Rolls-Royce Nimbus engine. When it first comes into service, the average lifespan of that engine is 10 hours. Average. Some of them last 2 to 4 hours before they need changing again. There's also a major problem in the cockpit. The fuel shut-off lever in the roof of the cockpit is directly beside the cabin heating lever, and both of them work in the same direction and look similar, which sounds really funny because it's laughable. That led to the death of Captain Dan Jacques de Bono from the Coldstream Guards and W02 Hutchinson 656 Squadron's RQHI on the 15th of July 1964, and as a result, the Scout was grounded at that point until they could work out a work through to stop this from happening. And the cabin heater, particularly in Borneo, where you don't really need the cabin heater, was wired shut to stop that happening again. It also had problems with vibration and was terrible if you had to auto-rotate. It auto-rotated like a brick. But it was the first it was the first helicopter that was designed specifically as a helicopter for the Army, and the Wasp variant for the Navy as well. So in that way, it was a bit of a game changer from the Army Air Corps. The Army Air Corps can suddenly do lots of things, as Michael's talk about in a moment, in Aden, that it couldn't do up until this point. And in fact, the Scout remains in service well into the 90s before it goes out of service. So these first two operations, or two of the first in Malaya and Borneo, are really important. The jungle experience that's built up there is transferred later in the early 1960s again to British Guyana, where that is, with the Alouette flying from 25 flight there, then into Belize for the operational phase in Belize at the beginning of the 1970s. And the Army Air Corps remained in Belize right through until the 2000s, and in Brunei up until 2022, with all that continuous jungle experience. And our regimental secretary who sat over there can tell us that the Army Air Corps is about to go back to Brunei after a brief period when the RAF tried to take it on. So I'll hand back to Mike at that point.
Yes, I'm going to talk about Aden. Strategically, after Suez, there's all this political friction between the US and Britain, saying basically you need to get out of the Far East and pull back. And the UK starts to do exactly that, but the defence reviews of the time come up with this idea that we need a super garrison somewhere out in the Middle East that we can forward base our logistics, supplies, and some ready use infantry units, etc., to go anywhere in the Middle East and potentially into the Far East if required. That is identified as Aden, which is already a British garrison, has been for hundreds of years before. So they start to build a brand new barracks, brand new airfield, etc., and this will be augmented by aircraft carrier groups which will float around up and down the Mediterranean and out to the Far East and back with commandos on board. So whenever there's a trouble spot, they can be augmented from Aden by a strategic airlift, and these aircraft carriers will take helicopters, etc., and do so. It's quite an agile, to use that horrible word that dominates defence doctrine at the moment, idea. And Aden is a big part of that. And Army aviation, the Army Air Corps, is also part of that, because there are issues to be dealt with in Aden itself. And for those who want to refresh themselves, you see where the Houthis are down in Yemen, etc. You can see that Aden is just below that. South Arabia, Dhofar, Oman, that trouble spot of the world, the heel of the boot of Arabia, and around to Straits of Hormuz. So this historically has been a place where the British have had the expertise and the influence and are trying to withdraw from it, and the Americans just encourage them to do that, but don't actually really want them to do it. When there's a problem, they want the Brits to deal with it. So there's a lot of friction between the UK and the US about how this should be done. And we are still pulling out of Kenya and places like that. There's lots, so it really is a really important strategic base. The area is mountainous, and you can see here, a bit of a zoom in here, and you can see Fumier in the centre of the map there. That's where most of the British helicopters will be based, and the RAF and Army Air Corps, under command of one Air Commodore Johnny Johnson, who's the RAF commander, who's Battle of Britain, Fighter Ace, etc. He will control that, and there are some RAF Belvedere helicopters, which are called the Flying Longhouse. The British attempt to build a Chinook version, which is about as successful as the Sycamore, to be honest, but it's a good idea. But it's arid, it's high altitude, lots of turbulence, mountainous, etc., and the borders don't reflect tribal boundaries. Who'd have thought it? So there's all kinds of problems, and there's a huge communist insurgent influence coming into Yemen. And the Brits are oblivious of this, building this new super garrison, thinking, we're going to stay here for a while, this is great, we're building schools, we're building modern airstrip, etc. And this is a long-term plan which falls flat on its face, and there'll be an insurgency. So we'll see here that you've got 653 Squadron, quite clearly the best squadron in the Army Air Corps by a long way. Basically, and that's made of a composite group of flights from 8 flight who start off with in Kenya and they're brought across, 13 flight which start off with the Auster and convert to the Scout, 15 flight which starts off with the Auster and converts to the Beaver, which is a real game changer alongside the Scout. And then the integrated air troops or platoons, which John has talked about, these integral units which belong to the battalions that rotate through, or the armoured corps units that rotate through, and they're flying the Sioux. And they're basically in the urban environment. So you've got quite a suite there, and it's called 653 Squadron, and it's called 3 Wing, and you end up with an Army Air Corps Lieutenant Colonel in charge of it. The integrated air troops do really well. The Sioux is a good aircraft. It's quite good for this role. The main thing, the most valuable thing about it is the radio, because it can call down. It's very good for forward air control. So you can call in RAF Hawker Hunter jets, etc., to hit targets. You can patrol. You can do reconnaissance. You can carry VIPs like commanding officers or brigade commanders to do reconnaissance, etc. And yes, you have seen it before. You've seen it in MASH and in Skippy, for those of a certain generation. But it's a good aircraft. And once they get the radios fixed, and it's integral with things like the Ferret Scout car and things that you'll see in the museum here. But these are being flown, as John said, by people from those particular units. I mean, some great stuff in the book from Mickey Martin, who was an Irish Guards pilot, who some of the things he did in his Sioux to get Hunter jets into the deep valleys of Aden and Radfan to do strikes are just phenomenal. These guys are doing things that you would be unthinkable, the risks that are taken, would not be taken today. Dropping flares overhead on terrorist positions, hovering overhead and then dropping flares so that hunters can see where to strike, that kind of thing, under fire, with no weapon other than their rifle or some guy with a pistol firing out the side. It's phenomenal what they did. It's real Biggle stuff. The Auster, having done well in the Far East, doesn't perform well in the Middle East. The altitude's wrong for it. It's underpowered. There are a number of accidents, and there's a bit of friction and resistance to change in that the hierarchy of the Army Air Corps at the time are all of an Auster generation, and think the Auster is the Excalibur that does everything, and can't face the fact that it actually can't do the job, and it's not. Until a number of crashes. Here's another one, and it's not all about the crashes, but they do sort of mark. And this is again turbulence, downdraft, and it drops into a 60-foot valley. And the pilot survives but loses an eye. So it's a good aircraft in Northwest Europe, which is designed to do. It's a good aircraft in the Far East. It's just not the right aircraft for Aden in the Middle East. And it takes a while for them to thrash out that and realise that it needs to go. The winning combination will be these two, the Beaver and the Auster. The Beaver, de Havilland in Canada, amazing aircraft, designed to fly in the tundra, to operate off icy fields. It can be fitted with skids, floats, you name it. Really powerful engine. Goes on for many years, serving in Northern Ireland, in Canada, etc. Any terrain, rugged terrain, it can do that. The Scout will develop. It does better in Aden than it does in the Far East. Same problem with engine wear. But the Saunders Rowe and Bristol and Rolls-Royce technicians who brought out to Aden, to the super garrison, to Thumier, to work on these engines, and they learn how to make them last longer and how to make the Scout pick up into the flying Land Rover that it will become. This is Britain's first attack helicopter, not just because you've seen it in Who Dares Wins with Lewis Collins, but because it actually is, and we'll get into that in a minute. It's a phenomenal aircraft, and it becomes the weapon of choice. Everybody wants it. This is 8 flights just before they depart Kenya to come to Aden. And these are the numbers that John was talking about. A couple of fuel Bowsers, a command truck, and Urimi technicians to keep it going. So they're quite light. These guys, when they're working in, I don't know if you can see, but the centre aircraft's got casualty evacuation pods on it as well. These guys, when working in Kenya, are putting their trucks in a circle around the helicopter to protect them from ground fire, from the Mau Mau and people like that. So, but it's almost Wild West style, and then they're brought out into Aden. This guy is Air Trooper Jim Turner, who was one of the first door gunners he was my next door neighbour when I was an RSM, and he was still an RSM many years later at Worcestershire. And he said, I was an Aden, I never used to believe him. And the stories he used to tell, he said, I was Sergeant Major 653 Squadron when I was Sergeant Major 653 Squadron, and then I found all his stuff and wrote to him, said, okay, I believe you, send me your stuff. But he was actually in the RTR, the Royal Tank Regiment at the time. He wore the berry for a photo opportunity, because as John said, there were no direct entry Army Air Corps ground crew at the time, but they were putting out that thing. But what we see here is general purpose machine gun fitted forward firing on the skid. There's one on the other side, and you can see just behind Jim's head there's another one on the side. So the Scout's carrying 3 machine guns, and it's doing that to support Special Air Service missions into the Radfan. So this is a proper attack helicopter, and some of the accounts you read about the gunfights that these guys get into, with the SAS using it as a weapon platform, it's a proper gunship, well ahead of its time. Augmented by the Beaver, and this is the then Major Nick Nichols, who was an ex-glider pilot at the end of the glider pilot era, and then was a 653 pilot. He flew this Beaver from RAF Middle Wallop, as it was, to Aden. So these solo pilot from Hampshire to the Middle East, as you do. These men are just phenomenal pilots. And he was, if you ever met Nick, he was the most dapper, intelligent guy. If you wanted to say a stereotypical, smart British officer, this is the guy.
He was also the guy that flew the Beaver from Malaya across to Borneo as well. Yeah.
And he just casually say, have you flown Beaver? Yeah, I flew Beaver. That's what you get, until you pushed him and said, And he was at Middle Wallop on the 1st of September when the glider pilot regiment flag came down. He was the adjutant, and the Army Air Corps flag went up, and the Blueberries officially came into existence. But the Beaver was a huge success in Aden. It proved itself in Borneo and Malaya, but it was absolutely ideal. So somebody asked me before we started, did the Army Air Corps have fixed wing? Yes, we did. The Auster, then the Beaver, then the Islander comes after that. And you can see it is recce, command, you can carry lift. The combination became, if you're in an operation, Scout gunships, Beaver resupply, doing parachute resupply. This thing could get in low, much lower, and resupply ammunition, etc. And it was quite a rugged aircraft. They fitted them with a GPMG side firing at the end of the Aden campaign, which is basically on an elastic strap, firing out the side to clear the perimeter. And then the RAF had always said, one of the things you can't do is be bombers. You can't fit bombs to Army Air Corps aircraft. We're not having that. This had racks for flares, to drop flares, or parachute resupply to mark targets or to resupply. So at the end, when the RAF were pulling out, they said, well, actually, why don't we try some bombs? So they actually fitted them with bombs and machine guns. So, the Beaver bomber was a little thing, but they did actually try it. So the combination of Beaver and Scout worked well. We had the right tools for the job. And then I spoke at the start about things being cyclic. This is Francis Graham Bell, who had the postcard and flew the Sycamore into Suez and was CO of 3 Wing and 653 Squadron. This quote epitomises what the Army Air Corps is, was, and ever more should be. And you think he's reinventing this because they realised that they were flying, the guys were operating up country away from Thumier, 100 plus miles away, and with 8 hours on your engine, spending half an hour flying backwards and forwards each day, burning an hour is really silly. And actually, if you want the battle picture, you need your dedicated signallers, a command post. And he came with the idea, why don't we call it a forward operating base? And we were in the Apache generation. So, we've got this new thing, it's called a forward operating base. And say, actually, these guys have done it for a long time before. But he's all about keeping in the picture. And what's interesting about it, it's almost colonial. In the book, we talk about the night before Operation Cat Badge, which we'll talk about in a moment, they had like a Waterloo ball with the Royal East Anglian Regiment, the 653 Squadron, etc. Had it with all the wives in the garrison, having a Waterloo ball and dance, and then flying off to do the big mission. And it equates it to that. It's during which they also go on to do the first ever heliborne night assault during that operation as well. So the first people to do it at night is the Army Air Corps using Scout. What comes out is that you need proper ground crew, no matter what cap badge they are. They come from integrated air platoons or troops, so they RTR, Royal Artillery, Service Corps, whatever they are. But it starts to develop, actually, we need people who understand radio comms for UHF, for helicopter comms, etc. We need people who can do refueling and do rearming, armourers, etc. We need door gunners. These things start to evolve, and what comes up is a spectrum of jobs that you need to be able to do. Because there's never going to be enough money to have individual trades like the RAF, you learn to do them all. So, for example, when I joined, you were trained as an air trooper, you were a driver, signaller, ground crewman, refueler. You had to do them all. So that's why, as John says, it was such good fun, because it was challenging, it was stimulating, it was good. And these are the first guys who are doing this, and you can see they look well fed, they look pretty happy with what they're doing. So we come up with a forward operating base. I picked out a couple of things. There are a number of operations. There's some very famous SAS operations in Aden which involve Scout helicopters, and there's this one, which is Operation Cat Badge on the 30th of April 64. And this is a quote from the post-operational report about how really good the Scout is for armed action, but how vulnerable it is. And you have to decide, are you going to risk, because you've only got 5 or 6 Scout aircraft in Aden, are you going to risk it for a biscuit? Are you going to put your aircraft in that much danger? This aircraft here was carrying Farah the Para, Colonel Farah Hockley, who was the CEO of 3 Para during Operation Cat Badge, and 3 Para had arrived. They were the Theatre Reserve. They arrived from not Brunei, Middle East. Begins with a B. I can't remember. Gone out my head. Bahrain. Yeah, they were in Bahrain. And they were flown in and said, oh, we can stir things up a bit. Give us the Scout helicopters, give us the Beavers. And they set off on this operation with 4-5 Commando and 3 Para to take all the hilltops in the Radfan. And the formula is simple. They fly in by RAF transport, drop off, then they get picked up by RAF helicopters, they get taken forward, then they march, Yomp, Tab, whichever they prefer. And the support along the way is provided by Scouts and parachute resupplied by Beavers all the way up. And they take each hill in turn, with Suez providing forward air control. However, Farah Hockley is quite keen to get forward and persuades Staff Sergeant Jackson, who's a very good Army Air Corps pilot, to go forward. And they fly over the forward line of the Royal Marines, with the RSM and the Royal Marines waving, saying, don't go any further forward. And they following a re-entrance, and they come into under small arms fire. The Scout is hit in the fuel tank and makes a forced landing right on the front line. They sat in the middle. It makes the Daily Mail front page and the Daily Express. What are we going to do about this aircraft? Overnight, Francis Graham Bell brings forward some REME guys under cover of darkness using a torchlight, set about repairing this aircraft. First thing they have to do is drain all the fuel out of it. Most of it's already drained because the fuel tank's full of holes. So they think, right, so they bring the fuel forward by jerry can. How are we going to fix these holes? Well, it happens that a 2B pencil is the right size for the bullet holes. So they chop up the 2B pencil and plug 20 holes in the fuel tank with 2B pencil stubs, fill the tank again, and in the morning they fly it out and get away with it without, for some reason, without the insurgents destroying the aircraft on the ground as they could have done. And it's a running battle. Operation Cat Badge is a huge success, but there was a big concern at the time. If we lose one of our shiny new attack helicopters to tribesmen, how is that going to look? But they managed to get it out the next morning, so it's politically sensitive. Speaking of which, there's a number. This is a 653 operation with the Major Greville Edgecombe flying, who is known as low-level Greville, and for good reason. And he was one of the guys of our generation that the two of us know, and Bernie knew very well, who was one of those retired officers who sat in Regiment headquarters in a tweed jacket, and you thought, what's he all about? What does he do? And then you see the photograph of him here with his M16, his son, bare-chested, steely-eyed, square-chinned guy, and he's flying these operations. And there are a number of running fights where the SAS used Scouts to get in, to get out, to do medevac, etc., and even man the gun. The guy with his back to the camera is manning the machine gun on the side. They've got guns each side, flying in to find the to insert SAS patrol to attack enemy positions, but then using the Scouts as fire and manoeuvre as fire support bases for the guns to close with the enemy. That all goes on well, and actually you would argue that we're doing well. And certainly Army aviation comes out of the Aden campaign with flying colours, Gold Star. This is the way ahead. This is what we need to do. The Beaver, the Scout, the Sioux, perhaps the integrated air troops, different ball game. And there are a number of incidents. I could talk for the whole hour about Aden, and John's stopping me. But at the end, the last things to pull out of the Beavers are 15 flight. And this is an interesting picture because there are a number of British officers serving with Aden units who are the classic colonial officer advising native battalions to how to fight. And as the collapsing bag system starts happening, we start to pull out. So how do we get them out without them being lynched by their own troops? And so each Beaver pilot is tasked to go and get one each time. And they do that. They have to get out land, get out the aircraft and go and find them. And they've got a search and rescue beacon, radio SARB beacon. And as they do that, there are 2 RAF hunters flying overhead the whole time. And they go and get the guys out. And they manage to get them all out without them being taken hostage or being killed by native troops. So then at the end, it's okay, last one's out, turn the light out, and they're flying out on their way back out, and the aircraft in the foreground develops an oil fault which covers the windscreen in oil. So both aircraft land with the REME guys in the back to fix the engine, clear the windscreen, etc. But what happens is, this is in Djibouti, and it's undergoing a military coup at the time, and the ground crew are hostile, and people start arriving with AK-47s and surrounding these British officers, saying, you know, with an aircraft they can't get away in. Luckily, cue RAF hunters who are overhead again, circling really low, show of force to say, yeah, don't even think about it. So it's almost US-style tactics the Brits are using at this stage. And they get out, and they're the last ones out. And that's the end of the Aden campaign for us. What I'll just say before we hand over to John is they learn so much here about how to do things professionally, what aircraft you need, and many of the senior officers who run the Cold War for the Army Aviation are the pilots who flew these aircraft. And they learn about you really need proper aircraft for medevac, and the Army becomes, armed helicopters, we love them. Actually, the biggest thing that comes out of it is medevac, the psychological importance and moral importance of casualty evacuation, and having helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft with army crews and under the army chain of command, which you can call on, and people in the cockpit who understand what it means to be dropped a mile in the wrong place, understand what it means about directing artillery fire. You need army aviators, complemented by those hunters, of course, but you need the right person for the job.
So to finish off, I just want to talk about the sort of the next major operation that has a sort of impact on the Army Air Corps, and which the Army Air Corps has an impact on, and that's in Northern Ireland. So, as I said at the start, right from the birth of the Army Air Corps, they're in Northern Ireland on the 1st September 1957, countering something called the IRA's border campaign at the time, Operation Harvest, with a 13 flight of Austers, and then from 1963 Skeeter helicopters as well, which are working with the RUC. That comes to an end in 1962. There's a brief pause, and then, as we all know, Operation Banner, the Troubles, begin in 1969. And when they begin, there's only one integrated flying unit in Northern Ireland, and that's the 17th, 21st Lancers. And they have to move up to Piggery Ridge above Londonderry to work over Londonderry. And that's how the Army Air Corps' contribution to Operation Banner starts, but it grows pretty quickly and has a profound effect upon the Army Air Corps. So 666 Squadron, which I always think is not a good number to pick for an Army Air Corps squadron. 666 Squadron is formed as a dedicated squadron in Northern Ireland to counter the Troubles in late 1969, in October. And then really from 1970 you start to see reinforcements, and 653 Squadron, who've been in Aden, they arrive and go to Long Kesh and are based at Long Kesh. What we do see at the beginning of the 1970s is the demise of the integrated air scheme. So this is a Sioux from the 14th, 20th Hussars, who's taken a bullet in the engine block and is waiting for REME to turn up to check if it can continue flying. But really from the end of the 1960s through to about 1974, when it finishes completely, the integrated air scheme is on a decline. Now, as Mike said, it's actually been, in tactical terms, it's been really successful. In Borneo and in Aden, everybody shouts about how good it is. But in the wider scheme of things, it's a really bad idea because the experience and the material is being spread so thinly across the whole of the army. So helicopter spares, which are expensive, and quite difficult to get hold of, they're having to be sent all over the world to all of these small units. Pilot training, because so many pilots need to be trained to go to all these units, pilot training has to be diluted down, courses have to be cut down to make sure they can churn pilots through quickly enough. There aren't enough REME personnel to spread around all these units. So at the end of the 60s, the Army says, yeah, okay, this isn't going to work long term, and begins to draw it down. And the Army Air Corps then begins to hoover up a lot of these integrated air units and re-centralise them.
A cynic would say that was the original idea.
Yeah, and the Army Air Corps begins to re-centralise again from the mid 1970s essentially, and the term aviation is dropped, and the journal becomes the Army Air Corps Journal again, and all those really important things that happen. So as Northern Ireland develops, there are good things that I'll come on to, but there are issues as well. So particularly through the 1970s and into the 1980s, ground crew that we've spoken to only ever speak of Northern Ireland in completely derogatory terms. In fact, several of them referred to it as a punishment posting, because all those good things that happened in Aden and in Malaya and Borneo, they don't happen in Northern Ireland. There's no flexibility for them. There's no initiative. They're sat in these bases and they're doing the same thing day after day, refueling, pushing, pulling aircraft. There's no variety. As the security situation gets worse, they can't leave camp. So I'll just have to check the date. But on the 18th of May 1973, 4 senior NCOs from 652 Squadron were murdered by the IRA through a car bomb as they left a hotel one evening. So that clamps down on anybody going outside the wire, essentially. And all these places that they're being based in are all old RAF bases that have been shut since the end of the Second World War. So Ballykelly, St Angelo, Long Kesh, they're awful places to live in. And awful conditions, and when we come to Bestbrook as well in a moment. So it causes a real dip in morale in ground crew and makes it quite difficult to begin to recruit, because that's right at the point where they're beginning to recruit ground crew directly. On the plus side, a lot of the developments you see in the 1970s are ones that the Army Air Corps will carry throughout Northern Ireland and continue to develop. So there are some experiments in 1971 with air door gunners, taking the experience from Aden, and there's quite a public display of air door gunning up at McGilligan Point on the ranges up there. But it's decided by the hierarchy in Northern Ireland that the amount of damage presentationally that an air door gunner could do by making a mistake far outweighs any of the advantages of having air door gunners. So really they're stopped at the time, and they don't become a regular feature of Army Air Corps operations in Northern Ireland until the mid-1990s, when the air door gunners are professionalised to a greater extent. But going through a list, in 1971, armour is fitted to aircraft, mackerel on armour. The heli-telly appears on the Scout in 1973, so an airborne camera. Things like stabilised binoculars, navigation systems begin to come in, deck track through Northern Ireland. PNG, so the forerunner of MVG, night vision goggles, arrive in 1976, and tactics like the Eagle Patrol, Eagle vehicle checkpoints, they're all developed in the 1970s and continue throughout Northern Ireland and beyond into other theatres as well. And there's a massive growth of the Army Air Corps in Northern Ireland. So in June 1970, there were 10 Sioux helicopters in Northern Ireland. By the end of 1970, there were 16 Sioux and 5 Scouts. By mid-1973, there were 23 Sioux and 15 Scouts, all flying 80 hours a month in Northern Ireland. And it continues to grow from there. The first Gazelle flight operationally was in Northern Ireland in 1974, and the first Lynx flight was operationally in Northern Ireland in 1979. So it's a really important theatre for the Army Air Corps in bringing new technology in. And the operation for the Army Air Corps quickly sort of develops into two distinct operations almost. So there's the urban operations largely in Belfast and less so in Londonderry, which is to do with observation. And then in South Armagh becomes the real focus, particularly the movement of troops, because it becomes almost impossible to move troops by road without them being blown up. And so Bessbrook, that's Bessbrook in the early days. So a linen mill just northwest of Newry becomes home from home for generations of the Army Air Corps.
It was the busiest heliport in Europe.
Yeah, allegedly. Yeah. Known as Red 850, can park 8 helicopters in there at the same time, and it develops a whole new language for the Army Air Corps. You know, those of us that flew in and out still remember calling Red 850 approaching to the garden via the tube and various other strange calls that you would make. And buzzard ops was developed, so the infantry battalion would have a guy dedicated to helicopter movements, and that goes on, and there's buzzard ops in Iraq during the Iraq War later, and in Afghanistan as well. But there's also real issues, and I can see how we are now finishing. So helicopters are becoming increasingly engaged. So this is Bob Petrie's Scout that's engaged in March 1979. About 100 rounds from an M60 are fired at it. It takes 6 hits. You can see a bullet hole down in the chin. That bullet hole goes through the leg of Major Woodrow from the Grenadier Guards that's in the front seat at the time, being given a familiarisation flight. Good familiarisation. And it's only pretty much through the bullet that comes through the windscreen sprays Bob Petrie's face with glass and severs his communications lead on his helmet on the way through. And again, it's his skill of flying that gets it back down into Crossmaglen in one piece so that Major Woodrow. But the real problem is this. This is a plot that we put together during writing the book to try and get a grip of which squadrons were in Northern Ireland at any given time. And there's just a huge number of squadrons coming in and out of Northern Ireland on a very quick basis. And as you can see there, at its peak in 1974 is a huge number, and it has a profound effect on the Army Air Corps because people don't like it, essentially. So in 1978, in the 12 months leading up to November 1978, 176 of the Army Air Corps' 309 pilots leave the Army. Over half the pilots leave because they don't like this, essentially, and it's the same with ground crew as well. So by the time you get to the end of the 70s, which is pretty much where our book ends, the Army Air Corps is in trouble again because it's hemorrhaging manpower, and it needs to do something, particularly in Northern Ireland, to stabilise this situation, and that's where Volume 2 will begin.
We joined. We saved the day.
Yeah, we joined and saved the day. Not quite that early. Yeah. So we'll finish there. Thank you.